The sun scorched the square of cold pine as five Apache women were dragged before the crowd not as human beings, but as prizes for the highest bidder. Dust rose around their shackled feet while laughter and jeers tore through the heat. The auctioneer's voice cracked like a whip, and the mob surged forward, eager to see who would dare claim them. The air stank of sweat and cheap whiskey. Men shouted wagers as though the women were cattle. Women covered their mouths in shock, whispering rumors. Children, too young to understand, hurled pebbles that struck bare shoulders and bruised flesh. Yet none of the five begged. They stood in silence, each carrying a different fire. One tall and defiant, one restless and hot, blooded, one sharp-eyed and watchful, one trembling but tender, and one who kept her head bowed, her silence heavier than iron. Then a figure appeared at the edge of the square. Thin, stooped, and weathered by years of loneliness, he was hardly the sort to make anyone pause. Folks knew him as Skinny Rancher, the widower who lived alone on cracked land outside of town. He had buried his wife and son a decade ago and drifted since like a ghost among the living. No one noticed him until now. He clutched his hat in both hands, knuckles white, chest rising and falling as though the heat pressed the air out of him. His eyes flicked from the bound women to the crowd roaring around them. He could turn away, return to the dust and whiskey that had been his only companions. No one would care. No one would even remember. But something stirred inside, a voice long buried whispering that if he turned his back now, he would never again have the courage to stand. The auctioneer caught sight of him and sneered. Well, look who's here. Skinny Rancher himself. Think you can afford one of these mares? The crowd roared with laughter, slapping thighs and spitting insults. One man shouted, "Why not take all five? You'll finally have some company out there in your shack." Another spat in the dirt. They'll slit his throat before sunrise. Skinny Rancher didn't answer. He stepped onto the platform, boots sinking into the dust. With a trembling hand, he pulled a leather pouch from his pocket and tossed it at the auctioneer's feet. The clatter of coins on wood struck sharper than a whip. Silence rippled through the mob. The auctioneer's smirk faltered, then hardened. "Fine," he growled. "They're yours now, all five of them. And so is their fate." Chains rattled as soldiers shoved the women toward him. Their knees buckled, shackled feet scraping across the boards. The tall one lifted her chin, pride burning in her eyes. The fiery one spat, glaring at the mob. The sharp-eyed one studied him like a puzzle. The trembling one pressed close to her sisters. And the silent one, she did not look up, but her presence weighed more than all the rest. Hesitation gripped him. Then, slowly, he reached for the key. The soldier dangled mockingly, and one by one he unlocked the shackles. The chains hit the boards with dull clangs. The women did not thank him, nor plead. They stood straight, refusing to bow their heads before the jeering crowd. Laughter erupted again, crueler this time. "Look at that," someone shouted. "The weakest man in Cold Pine just bought himself an army of Apache brides." The rancher lowered his head but did not retreat. He pulled his tattered coat from his shoulders and placed it around the tallest woman, shielding her from the stairs. Then, with a small gesture, he urged them to follow. Together, they stepped down from the platform. The mob parted, eyes full of scorn, stones clattering in the dust behind them. 6 figures moved out through the gates, a frail rancher clutching his worn hat, and 5 Apache women bound now, not by chains, but by his trembling courage. And though no words passed between them, Skinny Rancher knew, from this day on, his life would never be the same. The road out of Cold Pine stretched long and red beneath the punishing sun. Dust swirled in slow clouds, clinging to clothes, stinging eyes, settling in every wrinkle and seam. 6 figures walked that road, their shadows stretching far behind them. The rancher's boots scuffed the dirt, worn hat pressed low against his brow, while the 5 Apache women followed, silent as specters. He did not know what to say. His throat ached with words he could not shape. All he had was a tattered coat, already draped across the shoulders of the tall woman who walked at the front. She bore it without thanks, her spine straight as a spear, her stride steady despite the blood at her heels. Beside her moved another with restless eyes, a spark of fire in every step. She kicked at stones, muttered in her own tongue, and every so often glanced at him with something between contempt and warning. The sharp-eyed one walked further back, her gaze shifting from horizon to horizon, cataloging every hill and shadow like a hawk measuring the land. The smallest of them trembled with each step, her bare feet dragging, her fingers clutching at the sleeve of her silent sister. Her breath came shallow, but her eyes soft, fearful, tender were fixed on the rancher as though searching for something she could not yet name. And the silent one, the most unreadable of all, kept her face lowered, her dark hair hanging loose like a veil. She never stumbled, never spoke, never looked up, but her presence pressed against him like a weight he could not ignore. Hours passed beneath the sun's hammer. None of them spoke, and only the rattle of a loose chain, still clinging to one ankle, broke the silence. The rancher felt every heartbeat echo in his chest, as though the road itself judged him with each step. When at last his shack appeared on the horizon, it looked smaller than he remembered. The wooden frame sagged, the roof warped by years of neglect. He had once called it home, but now, with 5 pairs of eyes studying its every flaw, it felt like a cage too fragile to shelter anyone. He pushed open the door. The hinges groaned. Inside, the air was stale with dust and loneliness. A single bed, a crooked table, a few chairs, nothing more. He stepped aside, hat twisting in his hands, unsure whether to welcome them or apologize. The tall woman entered first, lifting her chin as though daring the walls to collapse. The fiery one followed, sneering at the meager space. The sharp-eyed one touched the table, testing its balance, her gaze flicking to the windows as if measuring escape. The trembling girl hovered near the door until the silent sister guided her inside. For the first time, the rancher spoke. His voice rasped, clumsy with disuse. It ain't much, but it's all I've got. And the words hung in the room, brittle as old wood. No one answered. The fiery one laughed once, short and bitter. The sharp-eyed one narrowed her gaze. The tall one stood in silence, unreadable. The trembling one looked at him with something close to pity, and the silent one, she finally lifted her eyes for the briefest moment. There was no gratitude in them, no hatred either, only a darkness deep as a canyon. Then she looked away again. Night fell heavy over the plains. A lantern burned low, casting long shadows across the shack. The rancher sat at the table, fingers wrapped around a tin cup, listening to the shifting of bodies on the floorboards. He realized with a hollow weight that though he had brought 5 souls into his house, he was still as much a stranger to them as they were to him. Sleep came slow, broken by the sound of wind rattling the boards. 6 figures lay beneath one roof, bound not by trust, not yet by kinship, but by circumstance and silence. And though no chains remained on their wrists, the air was thick with doubt. In the darkness, the rancher closed his eyes, wondering if he had saved them or only doomed them all. Dawn broke pale and thin across the plains, but before the sun had fully cleared the ridges, noise stirred outside the ranch. At first it was distant, a shuffle of boots, the clink of bottles, laughter carried on the morning wind. Then it grew into a crowd, swelling until voices rattled against the wooden fence like stones against glass. The rancher set down the armful of firewood he had been carrying. His hand shook as he straightened, listening. Men were calling his name, some with drunken slurs, others with sharp jeers. A chorus of mockery, cruel and eager. He stepped to the porch, shoulders hunched, heart pounding. Before the gate, more than a dozen townsfolk stood in a loose mob. Some swayed with whiskey still sour on their breath. Others leaned on rifles as though daring him to defy them. Behind them, children threw pebbles at the fence, shouting and laughing. A man with a red face and a bent hat called out, "Hey, skinny rancher, what you gonna do with that herd of Apache mares? They'll slit your throat before long." Another bellowed, spitting into the dirt. "Too weak to guard yourself, huh? Had to buy women twice your size just to keep you safe." The crowd howled with laughter. Someone lobbed a stone that struck the porch, splintering wood near his feet. The rancher lowered his eyes, fingers tightening around the handle of his axe. Shame burned in his chest, familiar as an old wound. He had lived with whispers and laughter for years, but never had they stood so close to his door. Never had they mocked him with such venom in the presence of others he was sworn, however clumsily, to protect. The door creaked behind him. The rancher turned just as the tall Apache woman stepped out. Her bare feet were raw from the road, her hair tangled, her frame ragged. Yet she carried herself like a soldier on parade, shoulders squared, head high. She walked past him and stopped at the edge of the porch, facing the mob with eyes that burned steady and unflinching. The crowd's jeers stumbled into silence. Her gaze swept across them drunken farmers, smirking wives, restless boys, and it held something more dangerous than fury. It held command. She did not raise her voice. She did not threaten. She spoke only two words, rough with dust but sharp as steel. Enough. The word rolled through the morning air, striking harder than any weapon. One man tried to laugh, but it broke in his throat. Another spat to the side, unable to meet her eyes. Even the children stilled, pebbles dropping from their hands. The mob shifted uneasily, murmuring, no longer so bold. The rancher stood frozen, axe still trembling in his grip. He looked at the tall woman, her bruised wrists, her bloodied feet planted firmly in the dirt, her presence shielding him as no one ever had. His lips parted, but no words came. The silence stretched until the crowd, restless and uneasy, began to drift away. Some muttered curses under their breath, but none dared linger. Boots shuffled, stones scattered, and soon only the wind moved through the fence again. The tall woman turned then, her face unreadable. She glanced at the rancher, no smile, no thanks, only that steady fire in her eyes. Without a word, she returned inside, the door closing behind her with a hollow thud. The rancher remained on the porch, chest tight, heart hammering. Shame still burned in him, but something else flickered beneath it. A strange warmth, fragile as dawn, born of the fact that for the first time in many years, he had not stood alone. Night fell heavy over the plains, the kind of night where the wind carried whispers and the stars seemed too distant to care. The rancher sat inside his shack, lantern light flickering across the warped walls, while outside, the five Apache women settled into uneasy silence. Sleep came to none of them. Something in the air was wrong. It began with the thunder of hooves. Then the glow of torches appeared on the horizon, weaving down the slope like snakes of fire. The sound grew, boots stomping, voices shouting, laughter sharp as broken glass. The rancher's stomach turned cold. He rose, staring out the window as shadows swarmed around the fence. A voice bellowed from the dark. "Skinny rancher, hand over those Apache mares, or we'll burn you alive inside that shack." The mob cheered, banging rifles against the fence posts. Torches lifted high, flames dancing in the night wind. The rancher's hand shook as he turned to the wall. Hanging there was the old rifle, untouched since the day he buried his family. His breath caught as he reached for it. The wood felt foreign beneath his palms, heavy, demanding. He had sworn never to touch it again, but tonight, there was no choice. He stepped onto the porch, gun in hand, shoulders stiff, though his knees trembled. Before him, the mob pressed against the fence, half-drunk townsfolk, soldiers with hard eyes, boys eager to see blood. Their shouts crashed against him like waves, mocking, daring him to stand. Behind him, the door opened. The five Apache women emerged, one by one. The tall sister stood beside him, her eyes fierce beneath the torchlight. The fiery one gripped a knife she must have hidden in her rags, jaw set tight. The sharp-eyed woman whispered quickly, pointing to the barrels of water by the door. The trembling one clutched her arm, lips quivering in fear but refusing to run. And the silent one, her face unreadable, watched the mob with an intensity that made even him shiver. "Burn it!" someone roared, hurling a torch over the fence. Flames leapt as dry wood caught, crackling like a beast unleashed. The crowd roared approval. The rancher raised the rifle, sights trembling as he aimed above their heads. He sucked in a breath, pressed the trigger. The gun cracked through the night, echoing off the valley walls. Dust sprayed as the bullet struck the ground at their feet. For a moment, silence. The mob wavered, some flinching back. But then the jeers returned, harsher, louder. A man leapt forward, torch in one hand, blade in the other. Before the rancher could fire again, the fiery Apache woman sprang from the porch. She moved like lightning, slamming into the man and knocking him to the ground. Her knife flashed, pressing against his throat until he dropped the torch. The flames sputtered in the dirt, Gasps rippled through the mob. The rancher stood frozen, rifle still raised, staring at the woman crouched over her fallen foe. The tall sister pulled her back, her voice sharp but steady. The crowd shifted uneasily now, no longer sure this was a spectacle they wished to press. "Take another step," the rancher growled, voice hoarse but carrying into the night, "and I'll shoot you straight through." His hands still shook, but his eyes no longer wavered. For the first time, the mob saw not just a thin man they called a fool, but someone ready to stand. The fire at the fence crackled, smoke rising into the stars. The mob muttered, shuffled, cursed. One by one, torches lowered. The night hung thick with tension, but the charge had broken. Slowly, like a tide receding, the crowd began to drift back into the dark, leaving only smoke and the stink of their threats behind. The rancher lowered his rifle at last, chest heaving. He glanced to the women beside him, the tall one steady, the fiery one still trembling with rage, the sharp-eyed one calm and assessing, the trembling one clutching her hands, and the silent one whose gaze remained fixed on him. He had not won a battle, but for the first time in 10 long years, he had stood with others against the world. And in that moment, as the smoke curled into the black sky, Skinny Rancher felt something he thought he'd buried with his family. The first stirrings of resolve. The first light of dawn spilled over the ridge, staining the sky a deep crimson. Smoke from the night's fires still hung in the air, and the rancher stood at the edge of his porch, rifle heavy in his grip, eyes burning from exhaustion. Around him, the 5 Apache women lingered in silence, their faces pale in the ash-gray morning. The night had ended without blood, but peace had not come. Then came the sound, a low rumble, steady as thunder on the horizon. Hooves. Many of them. The rancher's stomach turned to stone. He raised his eyes to the ridgeline, and there they appeared, a line of mounted warriors, their spears glinting in the newborn sun, their banners snapping in the wind. At their head rode a man whose presence silenced the very earth, tall, broad, his hair long and streaked with silver. Chief White Hawk. The mob of Cold Pine, still lingering on the outskirts, gasped and cursed. Some reached for rifles, others backed away. Soldiers muttered uneasily, for they knew what it meant when an Apache war chief rode at dawn with his cavalry behind him. The balance had shifted. The chief guided his horse down the slope, each hoofstep deliberate, until he stood before the ranch. His gaze swept across the smoldering fence, the ragged rancher with his trembling rifle, and finally to the 5 women gathered at his side. When his eyes settled on them, the air grew heavy. "My daughter," his voice boomed, deep as distant thunder. "Why do you stand beside this white man?" The tall sister stepped forward, but it was not she who spoke. Instead, the silent one lifted her head. Her dark eyes shone with a mixture of defiance and sorrow. Her voice, rough but clear, cut through the stillness. "Because when this town sought to hang us, he cut the rope. When soldiers came to burn us alive, he stood with us." The rancher's heart stuttered. She had barely spoken a word until now, yet every syllable carried the weight of stone. The chief's expression did not soften. If anything, it grew darker, as though her words pierced him deeper than arrows. For a long moment, White Hawk studied the rancher. His gaze was unrelenting, measuring not his body but the spirit within. The rancher felt stripped bare under those eyes. Every weakness, every shame, every moment of cowardice seemed exposed, yet he did not lower his rifle. At last, the chief's mouth tightened, his voice rumbling like a warning from the earth itself. "If you fail her, you will pay with your life." The warriors behind him did not move, their faces carved from stone, their bows and lances poised. No war cry rose. No arrow flew. The chief pulled his reins, turning his mount back toward the ridge. In silence, the cavalry followed, the thunder of hooves fading until the valley lay still again. The rancher exhaled, his knees nearly buckling. Sweat trickled down his spine, though the morning air was cool. He sank onto the porch steps, the rifle slipping from his weary hands. Beside him, the silent woman's eyes glistened, though no tears fell. Her lips moved in a whisper barely louder than the wind. "He knows now. I am not alone." The rancher looked at her, and for the first time he saw not just the defiance born of suffering, but something fragile beneath it, like the faint glow of dawn breaking after endless night. Behind them, the other women began to tend the fire, to mend what the mob had broken. Smoke drifted upward, not of destruction this time, but of endurance. And the rancher realized with quiet certainty that his life, once marked only by loss, had taken a turn he could never walk back from. Night pressed in close around the shack, quiet except for the sigh of the prairie wind. After the storm of fire and threats, the stillness felt strange, almost hollow. The rancher sat at the crooked table, lantern light, throwing his shadow long against the wall. Across the room, the 5 Apache women gathered near the hearth, their faces drawn and weary. No one spoke at first. He cleared his throat, words rough from disuse. "You can rest here. It ain't much, but it's shelter." His voice sounded small in the silence. They did not answer, yet their eyes told stories more cutting than speech. The tall sister sat upright, back straight, as though carrying weight too heavy for anyone else. She tended to the smallest of them, binding her blistered feet with scraps of cloth. Every movement was careful, protective, as if she had vowed never to let harm touch the girl again. The fiery one paced like a caged animal, muttering under her breath, hands twitching as if always reaching for a weapon. "They'll come again," she hissed in her own tongue. Even without knowing the words, the rancher understood the meaning. Her anger radiated through the air, hot and restless. The sharp-eyed woman crouched by the door, watching the night through the cracks. She spoke little, but her gaze flicked constantly toward the barrels of water, the pile of firewood, the rifle leaning against the wall. She was already measuring defenses, planning for the next siege. The trembling one sat nearest the fire, clutching a scrap of blanket around her shoulders. Her eyes were wide, glassy, but when she looked at the rancher, there was something softer there, fear mingled with a fragile kind of trust, as though she wanted to believe he could keep them safe, even if her heart doubted it. And then there was the silent one. She sat apart, cross-legged in the shadows, her face unreadable. She did not tremble. She did not pace. Her eyes, half hidden beneath dark strands of hair, fixed on nothing and yet seemed to see everything. The rancher rose, crossing the floor slowly. He meant only to bring water, but as he knelt near her, the lamplight caught her wrist. His breath caught. There, beneath the grime and bruises, was a faint mark burned into her skin, an old brand, circular, with lines like the spread wings of a hawk. He reached out without thinking. "What's this?" His voice was barely above a whisper. In an instant, the tall sister moved between them, her hand gripping his arm with surprising strength. Her eyes burned with warning. He froze, realizing his mistake. Slowly, she released him, but the message was clear: do not pry. The silent one pulled her wrist back beneath her sleeve, lowering her gaze again. For the briefest moment, though, he had seen something flicker in her eyes. Not shame, not anger, something heavier, like the burden of a secret too dangerous to reveal. The room thickened with silence once more. The fiery one muttered. The sharp-eyed one checked the window again. The trembling one pressed closer to her sister. The tall one sat stiff, as though she alone bore the task of keeping the others safe. And the silent one, she remained still. But the rancher could not shake the image of that mark, the wings etched into her flesh. He lay down later on the hard floor, staring at the warped ceiling boards. Sleep did not come. That brand gnawed at his thoughts. He had seen it once before, years ago, in whispers carried through the saloons, the mark of White Hawk's bloodline. And as the wind moaned across the plains, a thought rooted itself in his chest, with a weight he could not ignore. The silent woman in his house might be no ordinary captive. She might be the daughter of the Apache chief himself. The prairie night was quiet, but not for long. The women stirred restlessly, as though they could hear what the rancher could not. Then the sound came, boots pounding in the dirt, the crack of bottles, and laughter dripping with menace. From the window, torchlight flickered like snakes winding through the dark. The rancher's pulse hammered. He had known they would return. Hatred did not burn out overnight, nor did whiskey drown pride. He gripped the rifle, leaning against the wall, its weight no longer foreign, though his hands still trembled. The mob swarmed the fence, more than before, faces red with drink, soldiers mixed among them, rifles glinting under torch fire. "Skinny rancher?" a voice slurred. "Come on out. Give us those Apache mares before we burn you with them." The crowd jeered, pounding the posts with sticks and rifle butts until the old wood groaned. The fiery woman growled low, knife already in her fist. She looked at the rancher as if daring him to stand aside. The sharp-eyed one darted to the barrels of water, whispering quick instructions. The tall sister planted herself at the door, jaw hard, while the trembling one clung to her arm. The silent one lingered in shadow, her gaze fixed on the torches as though she could will them to extinguish. A torch sailed over the fence and landed against the dry grass. Flames licked upward, hungry and fast. The mob roared with delight. The rancher stepped onto the porch. The firelight painted his face in streaks of orange, and for the first time, he did not look away from the crowd. His voice cracked but carried. "Leave now. This is your last chance." Laughter answered him. One soldier shoved forward, torch in hand. "Or what? Skinny? You gonna scare us with that toy?" The rancher raised the rifle. His fingers squeezed, and the crack of gunfire split the night. The bullet tore into the ground at the man's feet, spraying dust. The mob stumbled back, startled, but the shock lasted only a heartbeat. "Kill him," someone screamed. The soldier lunged, torch raised. Time slowed. The rancher's world narrowed to the sight of that torch, the smell of smoke, the rush of boots. His finger pulled the trigger again. The rifle kicked against his shoulder. The soldier jerked backward, a red bloom spreading across his chest. The torch tumbled from his grasp, dying in the dirt. Silence gripped the mob. The man lay in the dust, blood soaking into the earth. For a long moment, no one moved. Then gasps, curses, shouts tore through the crowd. The fiery woman stood beside the rancher now, her knife gleaming. The tall sister's hand steadied his arm, though her eyes betrayed no surprise. The trembling one hid her face against her sister's side. The sharp-eyed one barked for water, dousing the flames at the fence. And the silent one, her eyes lingered on him, unreadable, as though she had seen this moment in him all along. The mob wavered. They had come for sport, for cruelty, not for war. And now one of their own lay dead. Fear whispered through them, cooling the fire in their blood. Torches lowered. Voices shrank. One by one, they backed away into the night, dragging their courage with them. The rancher's hand shook as he lowered the rifle. His chest heaved, his throat dry as ash. He stared at the body in the dirt, at the dark stains spreading wider, and felt his stomach twist. For 10 years he had avoided this. 10 years of silence, of whiskey, of burying the man he once was. Now the gun had spoken again, and there was no taking it back. He staggered inside, sinking against the wall. His vision swam. The fiery woman crouched before him, eyes blazing not with anger, but something closer to respect. The tall sister stood guard at the door, her presence steady as stone. The others lingered near the fire, their faces lit by its glow. The silent one watched him longest. She said nothing, only met his eyes with that canyon-deep gaze. And though no words passed, the rancher felt her judgment, her recognition. Outside, the night was quiet again. Smoke curled into the stars. But inside the ranch, the weight of what he had done pressed down heavy. For the first time in years, Skinny Rancher had pulled the trigger. And for the first time in his life, he had taken a man's life not for war, not for duty, but for the sake of others who now shared his roof. The body was gone by morning, carried off in the night by those too ashamed to face dawn beside it. Yet the stain remained, a dark patch in the dirt just beyond the fence, soaking into the prairie earth, refusing to be forgotten. The rancher's eyes kept drifting to it, no matter how he tried to look away. He sat on the porch steps, rifle leaning against his knee, hands trembling though the air was still. Each breath dragged heavy, as if the weight of that single shot had lodged inside his chest. For 10 years he had sworn never to fire again, never to hold death in his hands. But now the memory of the man's face, the shock in his eyes as he fell, gnawed at him like a coyote at bone. Behind him, the shack stirred with life. The Apache women moved quietly, each in their way. The tall sister tended the trembling one's wounds, binding her feet with clean strips of cloth torn from the rancher's shirts. The fiery woman paced the floor, muttering about vengeance, her blade always close at hand. The sharp-eyed one stacked firewood near the door, her every motion deliberate, preparing as though another attack might come any moment. And the silent one? She watched him. She always seemed to watch him, though he rarely caught her eyes directly. When he did, it was like staring into something vast and unknowable, something that had endured suffering far greater than his own. At midday, he forced himself to work. He hauled water, mended fence posts, patched holes in the roof. His body moved on habit, but his thoughts circled like vultures. Each swing of the hammer, each lift of the bucket carried the same question: had he crossed a line he could never return from? That evening, as the sun bled red across the plains, he sat at the table with them. The fire in the hearth crackled low. For the first time, they ate together bread he had baked clumsily, beans simmered in an iron pot, a bit of dried meat stretched thin. The meal was poor, but it was shared. The fiery one complained under her breath, but ate heartily. The sharp-eyed one divided portions with surprising fairness. The tall sister ensured the trembling girl had enough, pressing her hand gently when she hesitated. And the silent one? She lifted her bowl slowly, met his gaze for a heartbeat, and then drank. It was a small thing, but it struck him harder than the gun's recoil. For a moment, there was no mob, no jeers, no blood soaking into the earth outside. Only 6 souls bound together by hunger and firelight. Later, when the others lay in uneasy sleep, the rancher remained awake. He stepped outside, the prairie wind tugging at his coat. He stared at the stain in the dirt, that stubborn reminder of what he had done. His hands trembled less now, but the weight was still there. The door creaked. He turned and found the silent woman standing in the threshold. Her hair hung loose, her face unreadable in the moonlight. She said nothing, only stepped forward and stood beside him, her presence steady as stone. For a long while, they stood together, 2 silhouettes against the night. No words passed, but the silence between them felt different than before, not the silence of strangers, but of something slowly, painfully, becoming shared. The rancher lowered his head. He did not know if he had damned himself with that shot, or if he had saved them all. But as the wind swept across the plains, carrying the scent of firewood and earth, he understood one thing with quiet clarity. Whatever came next, he would not face it alone. The days after the killing passed in uneasy quiet. No townsfolk came near the ranch, but the silence felt less like peace and more like the stillness before a storm. The rancher worked harder than ever, repairing fences, hauling water, stacking firewood high, yet every sound in the distance made him lift his head, expecting boots, torches, or worse. The women watched him differently now. The fiery one no longer sneered at his weakness, though her eyes still sparked with challenge. The sharp-eyed one seemed to study him as carefully as she did the horizon, weighing his choices. The trembling one began to linger near when he worked, offering small gestures, passing a tool, fetching water as though she wanted to help. The tall sister remained vigilant, unbending as a sentinel. And the silent one, she carried her secret like a shadow, but sometimes her gaze lingered on him a fraction longer, as if testing the ground between them. It was near dusk when the storm finally came. The sound of hooves shook the valley, steady, deliberate, not the drunken chaos of townsfolk, but the disciplined thunder of warriors. The rancher froze, heart pounding. From the ridge, they appeared again. Apache riders, their lances glinting in the dying sun. At their head rode Chief White Hawk, his silver-streaked hair flowing, his presence like stone carved from the earth itself. The rancher gripped his rifle, though some part of him knew it would do no good. Dozens of riders filled the slope, their bows strung, their eyes fierce. He stepped onto the porch, shoulders stiff, trying to stand tall though his knees trembled. The women gathered behind him, silent but steady. The chief rode forward, stopping at the fence. His gaze swept the ranch, the smoke from the hearth. The women clustered near the doorway. His voice carried like thunder rolling across the plain. "You killed one of theirs," he said. Not a question but a statement. The rancher's throat tightened. He nodded once. "I did. To protect them." His voice cracked, but he forced the words out. "I'll face what comes, but I won't hand them over." The chief studied him long, the silence stretching until it felt like the valley itself held its breath. Then his eyes shifted to the women. The tall sister stepped forward first, her chin high. She spoke quickly in Apache, her tone firm, protective. The fiery one added her voice, sharp and insistent. The sharp-eyed one nodded once, as if sealing their words with truth. Even the trembling one whispered something, clutching her sister's sleeve but refusing to hide. At last, the silent one stepped past them all. She faced her father, and for the first time her voice rang clear, though rough with old wounds. He stood with us when no one else would. The chief's jaw tightened. He looked at her long, then back at the rancher. His silence weighed heavier than any shout. Finally, he spoke. If you betray her, if you betray them, you will not live to see another dawn. With that, he turned his horse. The warriors wheeled with him, a tide of hooves retreating into the horizon. Their thunder faded, leaving only wind and dust. The rancher lowered his rifle slowly, breath shuddering. His hand shook, but inside him, something steadied. He had not been accepted. Not yet. But he had not been cast aside either. Behind him, the women remained quiet. The silent one lingered at his side, her expression unreadable. But for the first time, her gaze softened just enough for him to believe that the storm was not yet his enemy, but a trial he might endure. The prairie night was thick with heat, the kind that made the air shimmer even after sundown. The rancher sat by the hearth, oil lamp sputtering, when the first distant crack reached his ears. A rifle shot, then another. His blood froze. The sharp-eyed woman was already at the window, her voice low but urgent. They're coming. Within minutes, the valley lit with torches, dozens more than before. Soldiers marched alongside drunken townsfolk, their shouts carrying through the night. The mob had returned, but this time not to jeer. This time, they came to kill. The rancher took his rifle, his palms slick with sweat. His legs shook, yet his steps carried him to the porch. Outside, torches bobbed like fiery eyes in the dark, closing in. He could see their faces now hardened, cruel, hungry for violence. "Colton," a soldier roared. "Step aside, hand over those Apache whores or we'll burn you alive with them." The rancher lifted his rifle, his voice rough but steady. "If you want them, you'll have to go through me." Laughter split the night. A bottle smashed against the fence, flames licking dry wood. The mob surged forward, rifles raised, boots pounding. Then the Apache women stepped out beside him. The tall sister stood firm, her shoulders like stone. The fiery one twirled her knife with a grin that bordered on madness. The sharp-eyed one slipped a bow into her hands, string taut. The trembling one clutched a short spear, her body shaking but her stance rooted. And the silent one, her gaze burned, knife glinting in her grip, the brand of white hawk's line hidden beneath her sleeve. The mob charged. The rancher fired. The crack of the rifle tore through the night, dropping a man mid-step. The sharp-eyed woman loosed an arrow, another fell. The fiery one lunged forward, blade flashing as she cut a soldier across the arm. The tall sister shoved the trembling one behind her, then swung a heavy staff into a man's jaw, felling him like timber. The fight became chaos. Smoke, fire, screams, and the thunder of gunfire. The rancher reloaded with shaking hands, fired again, felt the rifle slam into his shoulder. His ears rang, his chest burned, but he did not falter. A soldier broke through, torch in hand. He lunged for the shack. The silent woman moved like lightning, her knife flashing once, twice. The man dropped, the torch rolling harmlessly into the dirt. She stood over him, chest heaving, her eyes wild with a fury the rancher had never seen unleashed. The mob wavered, but still they pressed, driven by rage and fear. The fence blazed, collapsing in sparks. Figures poured through the smoke. The rancher raised his rifle, but a musket ball slammed into the post beside his head, showering him with splinters. He stumbled, ears ringing. The tall sister caught his arm, dragging him upright. Her eyes burned into his stand. He gritted his teeth and pulled the trigger again. Another shot, another man down. The tide slowed. The mob, once so loud, now faltered at the sight of their dead strewn across the dirt. Their jeers turned to curses, then to shouts of retreat. One by one, they scattered, dragging the wounded, abandoning their torches to die in the dust. Silence crashed over the ranch, broken only by the crackle of flames and the ragged breaths of those who remained standing. The ground was littered with shadows, bodies still, weapons dropped. The rancher sank to his knees, rifle slipping from his hands. His chest heaved, his vision blurred. The five women gathered around him, their faces lit by the dying fire. None spoke. They did not need to, for in that moment, beneath the smoke and stars, the rancher knew. He had stood his last stand and lived. Dawn crept slowly across the valley, pale and fragile, as though the sun itself was wary of what it would find. Smoke drifted from the charred fence, curling skyward in thin gray ribbons. The yard was silent, save for the sigh of the prairie wind brushing over the scars of battle. The rancher stood in the doorway, rifle hanging loose in his hand. His body ached, every bone and muscle protesting, yet he remained upright. The ground before the porch bore dark stains, the kind the earth would drink but never forget. He had taken lives, and though his chest felt heavy with that truth, another weight pressed deeper, the knowledge that without him, without all of them, there would be no one left standing. Behind him, the shack stirred with quiet motion. The tall sister emerged first, her shoulders square despite the cuts on her arms. She glanced at the rancher, then at the valley, her expression unreadable but her presence steady, as though declaring that the night had not broken her. The fiery one stumbled out next, hair matted, knife still in her fist though her hands shook from exhaustion. She met the rancher's eyes and gave the faintest grin, a flash of defiance that said, "We lived, and that is enough." The sharp-eyed woman followed, dragging a half-burned plank of wood to reinforce the broken fence. Even in ruin, she prepared for what came next. Her eyes flicked to the horizon again and again, searching, never trusting silence. The trembling one clung to her sister's side, her face pale but her chin lifted. She had fought, and though fear still lingered in her gaze, pride stirred there too, a fragile ember refusing to die. And then came the silent one. She stepped into the light, her face calm, her eyes deep. She carried no weapon now, only the brand upon her wrist hidden beneath her sleeve. She walked to the porch and stood beside the rancher, not behind him, not apart. For a long moment, they all looked out over the valley together. 6 souls, bound not by choice, but by fire and blood. The rancher drew a breath, the first that did not feel like ash. "I thought I was finished," he said quietly, voice rough from smoke and shouting. "But maybe this is just the beginning." End quote. The tall sister nodded once, solemn. The fiery one snorted, muttering something sharp that earned the faintest smile from her companions. The sharp-eyed woman tightened the rope on a post, her silence its own agreement. The trembling one pressed closer to her sister, eyes soft, steady on the rancher. The silent one met his gaze at last. No words passed. None were needed. In her look, he saw something he had not known in 10 years' trust. Not full, not easy, but real. The sun rose higher, burning the smoke into blue sky. The ranch stood battered, its fence broken, its grounds scarred. Yet it still stood, and so did they. The rancher lowered his rifle, leaning it against the wall. His hands were still, his chest steady. For the first time in a decade, he did not feel alone. They were not yet family by blood, but by fire, by survival, by the long road of exile they had become something more. And as the prairie wind swept across the valley, carrying the scent of smoke and new dawn, the rancher knew with quiet certainty. Whatever storms came next, they would face them together.